There is a moment at the very edge of an old map where the lines of ink become uncertain, where a cartographer, having traced every coastline he knew, every river he had heard of, every mountain range described to him by a returning sailor, suddenly runs out of reliable geography. And in that blank space he writes not nothing, he writes a word, a name, a promise that something lies beyond. For the ancient Greeks, one of those names, whispered at the rim of the known world, was Hyperborea, beyond the north wind. That is what the word means. Beyond Boreas, the god who howled down from the cold mountains and scattered ships and stripped orchards bare. Past the snow and the gray sea and the unreachable horizon. There, in a direction that no ship could reliably reach and no road reliably find, the Greeks imagined a civilization, not savage, not monstrous, not dark, but luminous. People who knew no sickness, who never grew old, who spent their days in music and feasting and sacred ritual, blessed by a god who loved them beyond all others. A land where the sun never failed, where the earth gave twice as much grain as it took in labor, and where the very act of living was a kind of perpetual prayer. This is the story of Hyperborea, not just as a myth, but as a mirror. A vast, glowing mirror held up by civilization after civilization, each one peering into it and seeing what they most desperately wanted to believe about the world. That somewhere beyond the hard edges of ordinary life, there exists a place where everything is as it should have always been. If this story speaks to you, if it stirs something deep and unhurried in you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep Story. Every video on this channel is a journey into the deep past, told at the pace the night deserves. Now, let the world quiet itself around you. The ordinary noise of the present fades. We are going to travel, not north exactly, not in any direction a compass can describe, but into the oldest kind of geography there is, the geography of longing. And we begin, as all such journeys must, at the very beginning. Long before Hyperborea had a fixed location on any map, it had a sound. It had a feeling. The Greeks used the word hyper to mean beyond, not merely over, not simply across, but beyond in the sense that implies a kind of inaccessibility, a beyondness that is almost moral rather than spatial. And Boreas was the north wind himself, not an abstraction, not a meteorological phenomenon, but a god. A living, breathing, roaring divinity who blew down from the mountains of Thrace with a cold that felt personal, a cold that seemed to mean something. He was violent in the myths. He had abducted a mortal woman, Orythia, carrying her off into the sky. His sons were warriors. His presence on the landscape was overwhelming, immediate, and sometimes terrible. So when someone said Hyperborea, beyond Boreas, they were not merely pointing at a direction. They were pointing at a place that existed past all that violence, past the howling, past the cold and the terror, into a silence that was not absence but fullness. A silence so complete it had become music. This matters because the Greeks were not naive. They were not simply a people who imagined paradise and forgot to look for it. Their intellectual tradition was one of the most rigorous the ancient world produced. They asked hard questions about the shape of the earth, the behavior of rivers, the reliability of travelers' accounts. And yet, even their sharpest minds, Herodotus, who was deeply skeptical about almost everything, Aristotle, who was practically the inventor of empiricism, could not quite let go of Hyperborea, could not dismiss it entirely, because Hyperborea answered something that no amount of rationalism could fully quieten. The ancient, persistent human sense that the ordinary world is not the whole world, and that somewhere, waiting past the farthest reach of the known, a better version of existence continues undisturbed. The earliest textual traces of Hyperborea reach back into the mists of Greek literary history. The Pseudo-Hesiotic Catalogue of Women, a poem composed around the late 8th or early 7th century before the Common Era, contains one of the first surviving references. The Hyperboreans appear there as the well-horsed people, a phrase that links them to the nomadic cultures of the north, perhaps the horse-breeding peoples of the Eurasian steppe, seen dimly through the haze of rumor and trade routes. They are already associated with divine favor. They are already more than ordinary mortals. Hesiod himself, writing in his works and days at roughly the same period, described the Golden Age, that first and most luminous era of human existence when men lived, as he put it, like gods. Free from toil, free from sorrow, free from the ruinous decay of old age. The earth yielded her fruits without being asked. Grain grew without plowing. The sky was always clement. It is not difficult to see how this vision of a lost golden past and the vision of a perpetual golden north eventually blurred into each other. For the Greeks, Hyperborea was not merely a place. It was the golden age somehow still in progress. A place that had not fallen. A people who, by some extraordinary grace of geography or divine favor, still lived the way all humans once lived, before labor and death and war had come to define existence. And then there was Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey do not mention Hyperborea by name, or at least not in the text as they have survived. But Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, tells us that Homer's last work, a poem called the Epigone, did mention the Hyperboreans. And even in the surviving Homeric texts, there are echoes, references to blessed peoples at the edges of the world, to the Ethiopians who live at the farthest reaches and receive the gods as guests, to northern lands of strange and continuous light. The mythological grammar was already forming. The idea that the edges of the world were where divine things collected, where the ordinary rules of mortal suffering did not apply, was already embedded in Greek thought before any single author gave it formal expression. This is one of the remarkable things about Hyperborea. It was not invented in a single act of imagination. It coalesced. It grew from dozens of sources simultaneously, from traders who came back with amber and stories about the north, from sailors who glimpsed coasts they could not identify and reported days that did not end, from priests at Delos who kept careful records of offerings arriving from distant lands wrapped in wheat straw and smelling of somewhere they had never been. The myth accumulated the way ancient things accumulate. Slowly, from many hands, each one adding a detail that felt true even if it could not be verified. Before we go further into the literary tradition, it is worth pausing to understand what the Greeks meant by the edge of the world more generally, because Hyperborea was one of a whole family of edge places that populated Greek geographical imagination, and understanding that family helps us understand Hyperborea's specific role within it. For the Greeks, the inhabited world, what they called the oikoumene, was a more or less circular territory surrounded by the great primordial river Oceanus, which flowed around everything. This ocean was not the same as the Mediterranean Sea or the Atlantic. It was a mythological body of water, the ancestor and boundary of all earthly waters, the outer circle that defined the limit of the known. Beyond the Oceanus, various traditions placed various extraordinary peoples. The Ethiopians in the far south, who feasted with the gods and lived in a state of divine favor analogous to the Hyperboreans of the north. The Pygmies, tiny people who fought cranes in their southern marshes. The Arimaspians and their gold-guarding griffins to the northeast. Each cardinal direction had its own edge people, its own tribe that lived at the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Hyperborea was the northern expression of this pattern. But it was distinguished from the other edge peoples by the quality of its strangeness, which was not bizarre or monstrous but beautiful and perfect. The one-eyed Arimaspians were strange because they were physically abnormal. The Pygmies were strange because they were tiny. The Ethiopians were strange because they lived in extreme heat. But the Hyperboreans were strange because they were better than ordinary humans, not worse. They were not deformed or diminished. They were enhanced. They were what humans could be if all the difficulties of ordinary human life were removed. The Hyperboreans were not a warning or a curiosity at the edge of the world. They were an aspiration. The word Boreas itself had a specific geography in Greek imagination. He lived in Thrace, the wild northern territory above Macedonia. He was the wind that came from the mountains above them, the cold breath of the interior. If he lived in Thrace, then what lay beyond Thrace was beyond his domain. And if you got past the place where the north wind originated, if you somehow slipped around the god and kept going, you would enter a world where his cold and violence simply did not reach, where the climate impossibly was gentle, where the sun, impossibly, shone day after day with the warmth of eternal summer. In a world without the instruments to understand the Arctic midnight sun, without the science to explain why northern latitudes could have different day lengths, the Greeks had invented a coherent and emotionally satisfying explanation. You could escape the north wind by going past it. There is a geographic logic to the myth in its own terms. Not the logic of modern cartography, but the logic of a world built around wind directions and divine personalities. Boreas brought the cold. But the cold was not infinite. It had a source. And if you could find the place beyond that source, if you could solve the puzzle of geography that the north wind itself suggested, you would find warmth and plenty on the other side. Hyperborea was not magic exactly. It was the natural consequence of pushing far enough past the god of the north wind. It was what lay on the other side of winter. The Riphean Mountains, a mythical range that appeared in Greek geographical writing for centuries, served as the boundary. These were the mountains that sheltered Hyperborea from the cold winds. They stood between the world of Boreas and the world beyond, taking the punishment of the weather so that the blessed people behind them could live in perpetual spring. Ancient authors placed the Riphean Mountains in many different locations. Hecataeus of Miletus thought they bordered the Black Sea, Pindar placed them near the Danube, Aristotle put them on the edges of Scythia, and Pomponius Mela, the first-century Roman geographer, shoved them all the way into the vicinity of the Arctic. But everyone agreed on what they did. They were the wall between the suffering world and the paradise beyond it. They were the last thing you had to pass through before arriving at a place where suffering simply stopped. What is most poignant about the Riphean Mountains, perhaps, is that they were never found. Ancient travelers pushed north again and again. The Scythians were documented. The Massagetæ were documented. The peoples of the Pontic steppe were described in detail, their customs recorded, their funerary practices mapped with care. But the Riphean Mountains never resolved into a real range. They retreated before every advancing expedition, always just a little further north than the last verified geography. They were, in this sense, precisely like the horizon, always the same distance away, always marking the edge of where you were rather than the beginning of somewhere you could reach. The Greeks, to their credit, recognized this quality. Several of their most careful thinkers were openly skeptical about Hyperborea as a physical place. But even the skeptics wrote about it. Even Herodotus, who would famously conclude his account of the Hyperboreans with a dry observation that essentially dismissed them as mythological, felt compelled to record everything anyone had ever said about them. Because even if you did not believe in Hyperborea, you had to acknowledge that everyone was talking about it, that it kept appearing in texts, that the people of Delos swore by it with great conviction, that offerings arrived at Apollo's shrine from a direction no one could precisely verify. Something was feeding the myth. Something was keeping it alive. And the name, Hyperborea, beyond the north wind, continued to echo through centuries of writing as a word that could not be put down. Of all the ancient voices that spoke about Hyperborea, none spoke with more beauty or more confidence than Pindar. Born around 518 before the Common Era in Thebes, Pindar was the greatest lyric poet of the Greek world, the composer who gave victory odes their perfected form, whose lines rang with such authority that later generations treated them almost as prophetic texts. He wrote about Hyperborea not as a skeptic, not as a geographer trying to locate it on a map, but as a poet who understood its meaning. And that meaning, in Pindar's telling, was almost unbearably luminous. His most famous treatment of Hyperborea appears in the 10th Pythian Ode, composed around 498 before the Common Era to celebrate a chariot victory at the Pythian Games. The occasion is athletic triumph. A young man named Hippocles has won a race, and Pindar, as was his custom, uses the occasion to soar into myth, to place the moment of human excellence within the vast landscape of divine stories. And where does his imagination take him? Northward, to the Hyperboreans. He writes that neither by ship nor on foot could you find the marvelous road to the gathering of the Hyperborean people. That the road was not a physical road but something else, a path whose condition was wonder itself. No ordinary vessel could navigate toward it. No ordinary stride could cover the distance. The way to Hyperborea was, in a specific and deliberate sense, not available to ordinary effort. You could not earn your way there by hard work or great sailing skill. You could not arrive through persistence. Hyperborea was a place that received you or it did not. It was a grace, not an achievement. And yet Perseus had been there. Perseus, the hero who slew the Gorgon, had entered the homes of the Hyperboreans and feasted among them. He had arrived to find them sacrificing glorious offerings of donkeys to the god Apollo, a detail that is both specific and strange, suggesting that Pindar or his sources had some particular tradition about Hyperborean religious practice, a tradition detailed enough to specify the animal. And in the festivals of those people and in their praises, Apollo greatly delighted. The god laughed, Pindar says, and this is one of the most vivid details in all of ancient literature about Hyperborea, this image of the bright god of music and prophecy laughing with pleasure at the cheerful abundance of his northern people's devotion. What the muse was never absent from their ways, Pindar says. Lyres crash and flutes cry, and everywhere maiden choruses are whirling. They bind gleaming laurel leaves in their hair. They throng with happy hearts to the revels. Neither illness nor the ruinous weight of old age mingles into that sacred race. They live without toil and without battle. They are set free from the remorseless vengeance of fate itself. The people of Hyperborea, in Pindar's telling, are not merely comfortable. They are exempt. Exempt from the very conditions that define mortal experience. No disease reaches them. No old age diminishes them. No war calls them. No nemesis, that Greek concept of divine retribution that brought down even the mightiest, could find them. They exist outside the circuit of tragedy that governs all other human lives. This was more than just a pleasant fantasy. It was a theological statement. In Pindar's worldview, tragedy was the default condition of mortal life precisely because mortals were separate from the gods. To be human was to be subject to aging, to illness, to the reversals of fortune. Hubris followed by nemesis, excellence followed by ruin. The entire Greek dramatic and poetic tradition was saturated with this understanding. But Hyperborea was an exception written into the very structure of the cosmos. A place where mortals somehow lived without the penalties of mortality. Not because they were immortal, they were still human, still a race, but because they were so perfectly aligned with divine will, so completely saturated with Apollo's favor, that the mechanisms of human suffering simply could not gain purchase on them. Consider what it meant for a Greek audience to hear this. The Greeks of the 5th century before the Common Era lived in a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary suffering. Their cities produced philosophy and theater and architecture of an almost impossible refinement. They also produced plague, war, exile, famine, and slavery on a routine basis. The Peloponnesian War, that decades-long catastrophe that eventually shattered the Athenian Empire, was coming. The tensions that would lead to it were already visible. And into this world of beautiful suffering, Pindar offered Hyperborea, a proof drawn from the deepest grammar of Greek mythology that the combination was not inevitable, that somewhere the beauty existed without the suffering, that somewhere the music played on without the plague arriving to silence it. What makes Pindar's Hyperborea particularly interesting from a structural standpoint is that it is embedded in a poem celebrating athletic victory. The immediate context is a young man who has won a chariot race at the Pythian Games. A real, historical, identifiable person, Hippocles of Thessaly, celebrating a real human achievement. And from this moment of real, transient human glory, Pindar soars upward to Hyperborea, to the place where glory is permanent, where the achievement of human happiness is not a fleeting victory subject to reversal but a permanent condition of existence. The connection is not accidental. Victory at the games was, in Greek thought, the mortal approximation of the blessed life. The moment when a human being most closely approached the state of divine favor that the Hyperboreans enjoyed permanently. The victor was, for that brief moment, as close to Apollo's world as an ordinary mortal could get. But it would pass. The victory would age, the athlete would slow, the laurel wreath would dry and crumble. Only in Hyperborea was the equivalent of that shining moment the permanent texture of daily life. This is why Pindar's Hyperborea is not escapism in the pejorative sense, not a retreat from the challenges of real life, but a statement about what real life was reaching toward. The athletic games were an institution dedicated to the pursuit of human excellence, and Hyperborea was the name for the place where excellence was not a pursuit but a given. The games pointed north in a way. They were a southern, mortal, temporary version of the permanently excellent life that the blessed people beyond the north wind lived every day. But Pindar was not merely writing wish fulfillment. He was doing something more sophisticated. By describing Hyperborea as unreachable by ordinary means, neither by ship nor on foot, he was placing it definitionally outside the reach of ambition. You could not conquer it. You could not colonize it. You could not send an expedition to verify its existence and return with amber samples and anthropological notes. It was immune to the Greek drive toward knowledge as control precisely because its road was not a road at all. It was a realm of pure receiving, pure grace, pure divine favor. And the only people who arrived there were those the place itself chose to admit. Perseus, Hercules, figures already half divine. This meant that Hyperborea served a specific psychological purpose in Greek culture. It was the place you could not ruin by finding. Every other paradise, every island of the blessed, every garden of the gods, was at risk of being located, mapped, converted into ordinary geography. But Hyperborea was protected by Pindar's own declaration of its inaccessibility. By insisting that no ship and no foot could find the road, he ensured that the place would forever remain pure, forever remain what it needed to be, a proof of possibility rather than a place you could visit. And what Pindar described there, in terms that would echo for centuries, was a kind of social perfection that matched the physical paradise. The people of Hyperborea were not solitary mystics. They were not isolated individuals having private spiritual experiences. They were a community, a people who sang together, danced together, feasted together, worshipped together. Their happiness was social happiness, collective happiness, the happiness of a civilization that had gotten something right that all other civilizations had gotten wrong. They had found the balance between individual joy and shared ritual. They had discovered a way to live together that did not degrade into conflict, that did not curdle into faction and envy and political violence. They were, in the deepest sense, a successful human community, and that, perhaps more than any other feature of the myth, is what made them so powerfully appealing to Greeks who knew exactly how difficult it was to build such a thing. Pindar was not alone in singing of this northern paradise. Simonides, his near contemporary, also wrote about the Hyperboreans. Thucydides touched on the same material. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the Hyperboreans appeared to be a standard piece of poetic furniture, a reference available to any lyric poet who needed to invoke the idea of blessed, uncorrupted existence. They were the poet's paradise, the lyric gold standard of human possibility. To mention them was to gesture at everything that was most right about a world that was mostly very wrong. Pindar's third Olympian ode adds another dimension to the picture. There, Hercules is described traveling to Hyperborea to find the sacred olive trees that would become the crowning wreaths at the Olympic Games. In that telling, Hyperborea was not just a paradise, it was a source, a place from which sacred things originated and then traveled south into the world of ordinary human civilization. The olive that crowned Olympic victors began in the gardens of the Hyperboreans. The games themselves, that great institution of Greek civilization, that extraordinary interruption of war in which all Greek states laid down their arms and competed in the harmony of athletics, were seeded from northern Greece. Hyperborea was not merely somewhere that existed independently of ordinary Greece. It was connected to Greece through the flow of sacred objects and sacred knowledge that moved from the blessed north into the suffering south. This is one of the most subtle and profound aspects of the Hyperborea myth, the idea that the sacred flows downhill from the perfect toward the imperfect, from the uncorrupted source toward the world that needs corrupting. The olive trees for the games came from Hyperborea. The offerings arrived at Delos from Hyperborea. The wandering healer Abras would eventually come from Hyperborea. There was a direction to the myth's geography, north to south, pure to impure, full to needing. And it gave Hyperborea a role not just as an escapist fantasy but as an active participant in the spiritual economy of the Greek world. The north was not simply a place you wished you could go. The north was a place that was already giving things to you, passing its blessedness southward through chains of intermediaries, ensuring that even ordinary Greeks who would never see its light could benefit from its grace. There is a particular pleasure in reading Herodotus on the subject of Hyperborea. He is perhaps the most famous skeptic of antiquity, the man who famously distinguished between what he saw with his own eyes, what he heard from reliable sources, and what he had merely been told by people he was not sure he trusted. He graded his evidence. He flagged his doubts, and when it came to Hyperborea, his doubts were substantial. His account appears in Book 4 of the Histories, the great section on Scythia that is itself one of the most remarkable pieces of ethnographic writing from the ancient world. Herodotus was writing about the peoples of the north, the Scythians, the Mesachdae, the various nomadic peoples of the Pontic steppe, and into this increasingly uncertain geography he had to address Hyperborea. Not because he believed in it unreservedly, but because it kept coming up. Because his sources kept mentioning it. Because any account of the far north that omitted it would be conspicuously incomplete. He begins with a striking admission of ignorance. Concerning the Hyperborean people, he says, "Neither the Scythians nor any other inhabitants of these lands tell us anything." This is a pointed observation. The Scythians, who were themselves from the far north and who had told him many other extraordinary things, including stories about one-eyed men and gold-guarding griffins, had nothing to say about the Hyperboreans. This silence was itself suggestive. If the Hyperboreans existed in the same general region as the Scythians would know about them. The Scythians knew their neighborhood. The fact that they had no Hyperborean stories made Herodotus deeply suspicious. But then he turns to a different source. The people of Delos, he says, have far the most to say about the Hyperboreans. And the Delians, it should be remembered, were not random informants. Delos was the sacred birthplace of Apollo, the most important sanctuary of the god in the entire Greek world, and the Delians were the custodians of a religious tradition that stretched back centuries. They had institutional memory. They had archives. They had ritual practices that made physical reference to Hyperborea in a way that demanded some kind of explanation. The account Herodotus gives from the Delians is remarkably specific. They say that holy offerings come wrapped in wheat straw from the Hyperboreans into Scythia, and from there each neighboring nation in succession forwards them westward until they reach the Adriatic, then southward until they arrive at Dodona, the great oracle of Zeus in northwestern Greece, and from there eventually to Delos. The relay of offerings, passing from hand to hand across thousands of miles of territory, was not something Herodotus invented or dismissed. He had evidence for it. He knew that the Thracian and Paeonian women who sacrificed to Artemis also used wheat straw in their offerings, in a way that suggested some connection to the same northern ritual practice. and the reason for the relay system was itself a story. According to the Delians, the Hyperboreans had originally tried to send their offerings directly. The first time they dispatched 2 young women, named Hyperoche and Laodice, accompanied by an escort of 5 men, to carry the sacred gifts all the way to Delos. But none of them returned. Whether they were killed, abducted, or simply lost to the enormous distance, the account does not specify. The Hyperboreans were distressed by this. They could not accept being in a state of perpetual sending people who never come back. So they devised the relay system: carry the gifts to the nearest neighbors, ask those neighbors to pass them on, and trust the chain of intermediaries to carry the sacred things to their destination. It is worth taking a moment to feel the full strangeness and beauty of this image. Imagine the journey of those offerings, wrapped in wheat straw, a practical packing material that also had ritual significance, since the same straw wrapping practice was observed among Thracian and Paeonian women in their own sacrificial traditions, suggesting that it was genuinely part of a Northern European ritual vocabulary. The packages are delivered to the nearest northern neighbors of the Hyperboreans. Those neighbors pass them to their neighbors. Tribe by tribe, people by people, the sacred bundle travels southward, handled by dozens of different hands, crossing dozens of different territories, moving through peoples who speak different languages and pray to different gods and have different customs around the sacred. Yet each one accepts the obligation of the relay. Each one carries the Hyperborean offering a step further south. And eventually, somehow, after this extraordinary chain of transmission, the bundle arrives at Delos, at Apollo's sanctuary, at the temple where the god was born. The image of the relay chain is, in a quiet way, one of the most humanizing aspects of the entire Hyperborean tradition. It says that even in a world of strangers, even across the vast social distance of a dozen different cultures, the sacred can travel. Trust can be maintained through chains of neighbors. The divine gift can find its way from the farthest reaches of the world to the place where it needs to be, not through any single miraculous act but through the accumulated small faithfulness of ordinary people who agree to carry what someone has placed in their hands and to pass it on. This detail, the relay of offerings through a chain of nations, is one of the most archaeologically interesting elements of the entire Hyperborea tradition. It describes a kind of sacred long-distance exchange system that had genuine parallels in Bronze Age Europe. The Baltic amber trade, for instance, moved southward through exactly this kind of relay network, passing from hand to hand across thousands of miles of European territory, arriving eventually at the Mediterranean shores where it was used for luxury goods and ritual purposes. The archaeologists Christian Christensen and Thomas Larson have specifically argued that the Hyperborea myth preserves a cultural memory of the Bronze Age amber trade, that the sacred objects wrapped in straw and passed from nation to nation were a mythological refraction of a real commercial and religious exchange system that connected Northern Europe to the Mediterranean world at least as early as the 8th century before the Common Era. If that is right, and it is a serious scholarly hypothesis, not mere speculation, then the Hyperborea myth encodes something real. Not a real paradise, not a real people who lived 1,000 years and never aged, but a real network of exchange, a real tradition of contact between the deep north and the warm south, that was so old and so fundamental to the cultural life of the period that it had been translated into mythological language and invested with divine significance. The amber came from the north. The north was where Apollo spent his winters. The sacred objects passed southward. The myth made sense of a reality that predated the myth itself by centuries. But Herodotus was also recording the story of Aristes, a poet from the island of Proconnesus who had lived, according to tradition, in the 7th century before the Common Era. Aristes had written a long poem, now lost, called the Arimaspia, which described a journey into the far north that he claimed to have made in a state of ecstatic possession. In his poem, he described the Isidones who lived somewhere in the Kazakh steppe. Beyond the Isidones lived the one-eyed Arimaspians. Beyond the Arimaspians were the gold-guarding griffins, mythological creatures, half lion and half eagle, who sat upon mountains of gold and prevented any human from taking it. And beyond even the griffins, at the very farthest reach of the inhabited world, were the Hyperboreans. This geography, Scythians, then Isidones, then one-eyed Arimaspians, then griffins, then Hyperboreans, is a layered frontier of increasing strangeness, a progressive departure from ordinary reality as you moved northward. Each group was stranger and more wonderful than the last. The Scythians were real, their customs well documented. The Isidones were probably real, their location approximately knowable. The one-eyed Arimaspians shaded into legend. The griffins were clearly mythological. And the Hyperboreans, at the absolute end of this sequence, were the most wonderful of all, the most perfect, the most removed from ordinary mortal experience. Aristeas's geography placed them in a sensible mythological relationship to the rest of the world. They were what you arrived at if you kept going past everything else. The ultimate destination. The end of the road that had no road. Aristes himself was a fascinating figure whose biography was entangled with the supernatural. Herodotus told the strange story of how Aristes had apparently died in a shop in Proconnesus, and then immediately been seen, alive, on the road in a completely different location. His body had disappeared from the locked room where it had been placed. Years later, he had reappeared in his home city and composed the Arimaspea before vanishing again. This was the story of a soul traveler, someone whose consciousness could detach from his body and journey to distant places. In the shamanic traditions of the Eurasian steppe, this kind of soul journey was a recognized and respected spiritual practice. The shaman's soul left the body and traveled to obtain knowledge from remote or supernatural places. Aristes and his northward journey to the Hyperboreans may preserve the memory of such a shamanistic tradition, filtered through Greek literary convention and invested with the credibility that came from being written down in epic verse. Herodotus kept his distance from all of this. He was aware of the Aristes story, he recorded it carefully, and he offered his own assessment. That Aristes probably did exist, that his poem probably did describe real geography to a certain degree, but that the more extravagant claims about soul travel and immortality were not the kind of thing a careful historian could vouch for. He also noted, with his characteristic dry wit, that he had never met anyone who claimed to have actually seen Hyperborea or met a Hyperborean. The offerings came from somewhere to the north. The Delians believed deeply in the tradition. But the physical reality of the paradise itself, that was beyond what the evidence could support. And yet, in what is perhaps the most famous moment of Herodotus's treatment of Hyperborea, he ends with a joke, or at least with something that looks like a joke. He says, if there really are Hyperboreans, then there must also be Hypernotians, people who live beyond the south wind. The symmetry of the argument is almost satirical. If the principle is that some special people live past every wind, then the logic applies in all directions equally, and the result is absurd. It was, scholars have argued, the only place in the entire histories where Herodotus can be seen actually laughing. The laugh was at the expense of mythological geography, at the habit of assuming that what existed in one direction of the compass must have its mirror image in every other direction. The joke was gentle but real, and it suggested that Herodotus, for all his careful recording of the Hyperborea tradition, found the literal interpretation of it more amusing than convincing. Yet he kept the material in. He did not dismiss it. He gave it pages. He described the relay of offerings with evident interest in the real trade networks it might represent. He recorded the story of Abaris, the Hyperborean healer who traveled the entire world on a golden arrow, performing miracles and purifying cities of plague, and then immediately said he was not going to tell that story. Not because it wasn't interesting, but because the storytelling mode it required was not the mode he was working in. He was a historian, not a mythographer. But he acknowledged that the story existed, that it was widely known, and that its details were extraordinary. In this way, even Herodotus's skepticism managed to transmit the Hyperborea tradition faithfully. He doubted it, he laughed at it a little, but he made sure posterity received every piece of it. To understand Hyperborea fully, you need to stand on Delos. You need to imagine the island as it was in the 5th century before the Common Era, not the abandoned ruin it became later, not the tourist site it is today with its marble lions and fallen columns, but the living center of Apollo's sacred world, a place so holy that no one was permitted to be born or to die on its soil. Pregnant women in their final weeks were taken off the island. The dying were removed. Death and birth, the two most intimate confrontations with mortality, were excluded from this place, as if the island existed outside the ordinary human cycle, in a space adjacent to the divine. That context matters enormously for understanding the Hyperborea connection. Delos was, in the Greek imagination, the birthplace of Apollo, the place where the god of light and music and prophecy had first entered the world. And the Hyperboreans, the people who lived in perpetual spring beyond the reach of suffering, had been sending sacred offerings to this place since time before memory. The connection was not coincidental. Both Delos and Hyperborea occupied the same symbolic space, places outside the normal circuit of mortal suffering, places where the divine was especially present, places that pointed toward a mode of existence that transcended the ordinary. According to the tradition recorded by Herodotus and elaborated by later writers, the very first Hyperborean emissaries to arrive at Delos were two young women named Arge and Opis. They had come, according to the Delians, before Hyperoche and Laodice, the better-known pair whose tragic failure to return eventually led to the relay system. Arge and Opus had arrived in the company of the gods themselves, according to the Delian account, accompanying Apollo and Artemis on their journey from the north. They had died on Delos, and their graves became permanent ritual sites. The girls of Delos, before their marriages, would cut a lock of their hair and wind it around a spindle and place it on the tomb of these two northern women. The boys would offer the first growth of beard from their faces, twist it around a green stalk, and leave it on the tomb. Generation after generation, the young people of Delos marked their transitions into adulthood by making offerings at the graves of two women who had come from somewhere beyond the north wind, centuries or millennia before. This is remarkable. It means that Hyperborea was not merely a literary myth or a philosophical concept. It was embedded in the actual ritual practice of one of the most important religious centers in the Greek world. The tombs of the Hyperborean women were real. The offerings at those tombs were real. The practice continued for centuries. And when the French archaeologists Charles Picard and Joseph Replat excavated at Delos in 1924, they found tombs in exactly the places Herodotus had described, behind the Temple of Artemis, in the precise locations that the ancient texts specified. The tombs dated from the Bronze Age, from the period between roughly 1875 and 1420 before the Common Era, and they contained Cycladic, Minoan, and Mycenaean pottery. A primitive cult had apparently been attached to these tombs in the earliest period of Cycladic and Mycenaean civilization. What this suggests is astonishing, that the Hyperborean connection to Delos was not an invention of the 5th century before the Common Era, not a story made up by Hellenistic scholars trying to enhance the prestige of the sanctuary. It was genuinely ancient. The tombs were Bronze Age. The cult was pre-classical. Something real and very old lay behind the tradition of northern women arriving at Delos with sacred offerings. Whether those original women came from what we would now call Northern Europe, or from somewhere closer, or from a now-forgotten tradition that Hyperborea eventually symbolized, is impossible to say with certainty. But they came from somewhere, and the memory of their coming was sufficiently powerful to persist in ritual practice for more than 1,000 years after their actual arrival. The later pair of Hyperborean emissaries, Hyperoche and Laodice, had a more complicated story. They too had come bearing sacred gifts, wrapped in the characteristic wheat straw, accompanied by an escort of 5 men. The Delians honored these men and called them the Perfories, the carriers, and gave them special honors on the island. But the women in their escort did not return home. Whether they died on Delos, were unable to find the return road, were unwilling to leave the proximity of the god, or simply vanished into the mythological obscurity that claimed so many ancient travelers, the accounts do not clearly say. Their disappearance was the reason the Hyperboreans instituted the relay system for future offerings, passing the gifts from neighbor to neighbor across the long chain of nations rather than entrusting them to ambassadors who might never return. The ritual life that grew up around these Hyperborean women on Delos was substantial. Their tombs were permanent fixtures of the sanctuary. The hymns composed in their honor by the ancient Lycian poet Olin were still being sung in the time of Herodotus. The specific ritual of hair offerings by young Delian men and women was associated explicitly with these northern arrivals. Delos claimed, through this tradition, a connection to the absolute source of Apollo's worship, not to the constructed traditions of classical Greece, but to something that had arrived from the mythological north, from the place where Apollo himself spent his winters and where his cult had its deepest and most ancient roots. The account given by Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century before the Common Era elaborates the Delos-Hyperborea connection in even more specific terms. According to his account, drawing on the earlier work of Hecataeus of Abdera, the Hyperboreans claimed that Apollo visited their island every 19 years, a period that corresponds to the Metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which the phases of the moon realign with the solar calendar. This was not a randomly chosen number. It was the period used in Greek astronomy and calendrical reckoning to synchronize solar and lunar time. Apollo's 19-year visit to Hyperborea was thus not just a myth of divine absence but a cosmological statement. The god of the sun and the god of music and the god of time's order returned to his northern home precisely when the cosmic clock completed its great 19-year cycle. Hyperborea was not outside time, it was where time went to be renewed. These visits were apparently spectacular. According to the Diodorus account, when Apollo arrived in Hyperborea every 19 years, he descended from the sky in his swan-drawn chariot, and the swans sang in greeting, and the entire community broke into song and music and dance that continued until the Pleiades rose in the morning sky, a reference to the heliacal rising of the Pleiades that marked the beginning of the Greek sailing season and of the agricultural year. Apollo's arrival was, in other words, the cosmic signal for renewal. It was the moment when the year turned, when the dark half gave way to the light half, when the world was officially authorized to begin again, and it happened first in Hyperborea before it happened anywhere else. The swans deserve a moment's attention. The white swan was one of Apollo's sacred animals throughout the Greek tradition, associated with his attributes of music, purity, and solar radiance. The image of Apollo arriving at Delphi or Delos on a swan-drawn chariot was an ancient and widespread one. But in the Hyperborea tradition, the swans are not just vehicles. They are also participants. The Hyperborean swans sang with the human voices in the hymns to the god. The elderly Hyperboreans, when they had lived long enough and were satiated with life, would leap into the lake formed by Phaeton's fall and be transformed into white swans, a detail that made the swans of Hyperborea literally the metamorphosed bodies of the oldest and most blessed of the northern people. In Hyperborea, the distinction between the human worshipper and the divine animal had become permeable. People became swans. Swans sang with people. The boundary between the human and the sacred had dissolved in the continuous warmth of Apollo's presence. There is a seasonality to the Apollo-Hyperborea connection that reveals one of the most sophisticated aspects of the myth. Apollo did not live permanently in Hyperborea. He spent his winters there. In the summer, the season of warmth and agriculture in the Greek world, the season of sailing and war and commerce, he was at his shrines in Delphi and Delos, available to the supplicants who came with their questions and their animals and their olive oil. But in the winter, when the Greek world turned inward, when the seas became impassable and the fields went bare and the great political dramas paused, Apollo went north. He retreated to his perfect people beyond the wind, and his oracles at Delphi went silent in his absence, or so at least some traditions held, replaced by the winter worship of Dionysus until the sun god returned. This is a profound mythological structure. It maps the pattern of solar retreat and return onto a divine narrative of preference and longing. Apollo did not merely go north because the sun went north in winter. He went north because he chose to, because Hyperborea was where he most wanted to be. Among the 12 Olympians, Apollo alone maintained this special northern relationship. He was the only one, the ancient writers noted with emphasis, who was venerated by the Hyperboreans. The other gods, Athena and Poseidon and Hera and all the rest, had no particular connection to the blessed northern people. But Apollo was theirs and they were his, in a bond that predated the formal structures of the Olympic pantheon. The poet Alcaeus, writing in the late 7th century before the Common Era, appears to have described Apollo's journey from Hyperborea to Delphi in a hymn that survives only in fragments. In those fragments, the images of the god arriving in Delphi as though from a great northward distance, traveling in brightness against the dark winter sky, bringing with him the warmth and illumination of his Hyperborean retreat. The arrival of Apollo at Delphi was, in this telling, the arrival of summer's return, the sun god coming back from his winter lodging in the north, bringing the light he had been accumulating in that blessed land back to the Mediterranean world that needed it. This structure, the divine source in the north, the divine energy radiating southward, the mortal world as the recipient of what originated in the blessed place, gave Hyperborea an active theological role in Greek religious life that went beyond mere legend. It explained why certain things happened. It explained why there was warmth after winter. It explained why the oracle at Delphi occasionally fell silent. It inserted the myth of the northern paradise into the real experience of seasonal change in a way that made the myth explanatorily useful. Hyperborea was not just beautiful. It was functional. It did work in the Greek theological system. The figure of Abras, the Hyperborean healer, extends this functionality in a particularly vivid direction. Abras was described in the ancient sources, by Herodotus, by Pindar, by Plato, by Iamblichus, and by many others, as a wandering holy man who traveled the entire known world on a golden arrow that Apollo had given him, healing cities afflicted by plague and purifying places contaminated by pollution. He ate nothing as he traveled. He performed miracles. He was described by one source as ethnically Hyperborean but culturally Greek, wearing Scythian clothing but speaking perfect Greek, a hybrid figure who embodied the north-south exchange at the human level. The golden arrow on which he flew was not just any arrow. According to some accounts, it was the same arrow that Apollo had used to slay the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giant craftsmen who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts. After killing them, Apollo had hidden the arrow in a mountain in Hyperborea. Abras had found it, and the god had given him permission to use it as his vehicle. The arrow was thus a piece of divine technology from the most sacred precinct of Hyperborea, repurposed for the healing of a mortal world that desperately needed it. Abras appeared in Sparta during a plague, and after his purification rites, the city was never again afflicted with the disease. Not in historical times, despite the suffocating heat from the nearby Mount Taygetus that would seem to favor pestilence. He performed similar purifications at Knossos in Crete, at various Greek cities along the coast, and according to tradition he played a role in averting a catastrophic plague that was devastating the entire known world, arriving as the Hyperborean ambassador to Athens when Apollo's oracle had directed the Athenians to pray on behalf of all peoples. He was, in essence, a walking embassy from the divine north to the suffering south. A proof that the sacred power Pindar had described so beautifully could actually travel, could actually manifest in the real world, could actually do something about the mess that ordinary mortal life had made of things. The connection between Abris and Pythagoras is also part of the ancient record. Some ancient sources claimed that the two had met, that Abris had recognized in Pythagoras a divine figure, possibly even Apollo himself in human form, and that Pythagoras had shown Abris his golden thigh as proof of his divine nature. Whether or not any of this happened in any literal sense, the association is culturally significant. Pythagoras was, among other things, the figure who brought a kind of sacred numerology and cosmic order thinking into Greek philosophy. His community in southern Italy was organized around ritual practice as well as mathematical inquiry. The association between him and the Hyperborean healer suggests that the Hyperborea tradition was not just a poet's fancy but was connected to the more serious philosophical and religious currents of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. Plato, in the Charmides, mentions Abris as a physician from the far north who healed the body through incantations that worked on the soul first, a concept of medicine in which the mind and the spirit were the true locus of health, and the body merely the downstream consequence of their condition. This was not folk medicine. This was a sophisticated medical philosophy, one that had genuine resonance with the emerging Greek theoretical medicine of the period. That this sophisticated approach to healing was attributed to someone from Hyperborea was a statement about where wisdom ultimately came from the north, from the place of divine proximity, from the people who had never lost the connection to the gods that ordinary humanity had misplaced somewhere back in the fall from the Golden Age. The Hyperboreans were also credited as the founders of Apollo's most important earthly shrines. The first temple at Delphi, according to some traditions, was not built of stone or marble but of beeswax and feathers, constructed by Hyperborean pilgrims in the earliest mythological era before the city of stone arose. When the Gauls attacked Delphi in 279 before the Common Era, the military historian's account described two phantoms appearing on the battlefield and routing the attackers. These phantoms were identified as the Hyperborean heroes Hyperoche and Laodice, the divine protectors of the sanctuary. Even in historical crisis, even in the moment of real military danger to Apollo's greatest oracle, the Hyperboreans were credited with defending it. Their connection to Delphi was not merely ancient tradition. It was, in the Greek telling, an active and ongoing protective relationship. And then there was the founding of the Olympic Games. The tradition recorded by Pindar in his third Olympian ode described Hercules, not the half-divine son of Zeus, but an earlier, more archaic Hercules associated with the dactyls, the first craftsman of the sacred, traveling to Hyperborea to obtain the wild olive trees from whose branches the winner's wreaths were made. He was so struck by the shade of those trees, by their beauty and their sacred quality, that he brought seedlings back and planted them at Olympia. The games in this telling were thus not just a Greek institution. They were a Hyperborean gift. The crown that sat on the head of every Olympic victor was woven from the descendants of those northern trees, and every victor was unknowingly wearing a piece of Hyperborea on their head. The physical landscape of Hyperborea, as it was described across multiple ancient sources, was detailed enough to constitute something like a composite portrait of paradise. At its heart flowed the river Eridanos, a river also associated with the myth of Phaethon, the young man who attempted to drive the chariot of the sun and lost control, plunging in flames into the northern waters below. His sisters, the Heliades, stood weeping on the riverbanks and were transformed into poplar trees that wept amber instead of sap. This myth gave Hyperborea a natural explanation for amber, that mysterious golden resin that washed up on northern shores and was traded southward along the Baltic amber routes into the Mediterranean world. The Hyperborean river Eridanos, lined with amber weeping poplars, was one of the oldest attempts in the Greek tradition to explain where this precious material came from, and it was also, characteristically, a beautiful explanation, one that made the amber a form of preserved grief, an eternal commemoration of a son's fatal ambition and his sister's inconsolable love. White swans lived along the Eridanos. Their song mingled with the music that the Hyperboreans themselves made without ceasing. The forests were called the Garden of Apollo, an extraordinary designation that made the entire natural landscape of Hyperborea a kind of extended sanctuary, a precinct of the god that was not a human construction but nature itself in its most divine state. The wild was the sacred here. The untended was the cultivated. The things that elsewhere required human labor, the vineyard, the orchard, the field, produced their abundance in Hyperborea simply by existing, simply by being themselves in the continuous warmth of Apollo's presence. The capital city of Hyperborea, for it had a city in the accounts of some writers, was ruled by the Boreads, the descendants of Boreas and Chione, the snow goddess. These were giant kings described in one account as being about 6 cubits in height, roughly 3 meters or close to 10 feet tall. They served as priests as well as rulers, managing the temple of Apollo and presiding over the sacred ceremonies. The temple itself was described as circular in shape, decorated with many votive offerings and surrounded by a sacred grove. The asses, those seemingly incongruous animals of Pindar's description, were sacrificed in hecatombs, which is to say in groups of 100, to the god whose laughter rang over their sacrifice with a particular pleasure he took in this northern people's straightforward, generous devotion. The presence of asses in the sacrifice is one of the more puzzling details of the Hyperborean tradition, and ancient commentators were themselves uncertain what to make of it. One possible explanation is that the detail preserves a memory of a real sacrificial tradition practiced by some northern people that Greek writers or their informants had encountered. Another is that the donkey was associated with humble, working-class virtue, the animal that carried burdens without complaint, and its sacrifice was a statement about the character of Hyperborean worship. Unpretentious, practical, wholehearted. A third possibility is that the detail had an allegorical or ironic function in the context of poetry, providing a comic counterpoint to the otherwise sublime perfection of the northern paradise. Even here, where everything was beautiful, the god was amused by the cheerful vulgarity of his most devoted worshippers' offerings. Whatever the explanation, the asses of Hyperborea became a fixed part of the tradition, appearing in multiple independent sources as though they were simply a known fact about the place, as regular and reliable as the amber-weeping poplars and the singing swans. The death practices of the Hyperboreans, as reported by Pliny, deserve their own attention in this portrait of the landscape. When a Hyperborean had lived long enough, when the feasting and the music and the dancing and the centuries of sacred proximity had finally satisfied even the most capacious of human capacities for joy, they would walk to a particular cliff and leap into the sea. This was not suicide in the modern sense, not a flight from unbearable suffering, but something almost the opposite, a deliberate, chosen completion of a life that had reached its natural fullness. The Hyperboreans did not die in a meaningful sense. They concluded. They finished. Their existence was a song that had a final note, and that final note was not sad because the song had been entirely played. This stands in the starkest possible contrast to the way death came in the ordinary Greek world. Unexpectedly, violently, through disease or war or the random malice of gods who did not particularly care about the individual mortals they afflicted. In Hyperborea, even the ending was beautiful. Even the transition out of life was a chosen act, a graceful departure rather than an ambush. The land and its people were of a piece from the first moment of existence to the last. Everything about Hyperborea was the way things ought to be, the way they would be if the world had been made better, if the fall from the Golden Age had somehow been averted, if the distance between the human and the divine had never opened into the terrible chasm it had become everywhere else. One of the most intellectually interesting aspects of the Hyperborea tradition is how thoroughly the Greeks disagreed about where it actually was. For a mythological place so consistently described, the same paradise, the same people, the same sacred relationship with Apollo appearing in text after text, the actual geographical location showed an almost comical variability. Over the course of roughly 7 centuries of classical Greek and Roman writing, Hyperborea was placed in at least 7 or 8 entirely different locations, sometimes by writers who were aware of what earlier authorities had said and simply chose to locate it differently anyway. The disagreement was not mere carelessness. It reflected a genuine intellectual problem. The Greeks knew that Hyperborea was supposed to be to the north. They knew it was past the Riphean Mountains. They knew it was associated with a land where the sun behaved unusually, where it rose and set only once a year, as some sources said, which would place it at or above the Arctic Circle. But the actual northern geography available to them was vague, contested, and changing. As Greek knowledge of the north expanded through trade, exploration, and military encounter, the horizon of known territory moved outward, and Hyperborea moved with it, always just past the edge of what was currently known, always in the next terra incognita, the next area where certainty ran out. Herodotus placed the Hyperboreans beyond the Isidones, whom he situated in what is now the Kazakh steppe. For him, Hyperborea was somewhere in Siberia, an enormous territory about which the Greeks knew almost nothing, which could accommodate any kind of mythological excess without embarrassing contradiction. Aristotle placed the Riphean Mountains on the borders of Scythia and Hyperborea further north still, suggesting a territory well above the Black Sea. Pindar, as we have seen, placed the Riphean Mountains and the Hyperboreans near the Danube, which would put Hyperborea in Central or Eastern Europe. Heraclides Ponticus identified the Riphean Mountains with the Alps, making the Hyperboreans a Celtic people living in or beyond the Alpine regions. The forebears, perhaps, of the Celtic tribes who would eventually push southward into Italy and threaten Rome. This Celtic identification was taken seriously by a significant number of Greek authors. Hecataeus of Abdera, in the 4th century before the Common Era, proposed one of the most geographically specific accounts of Hyperborea ever written. He described it as a large island in the Northern Ocean, no smaller, he said, than Sicily, located beyond the land of the Celts. This island had an unusually temperate climate and produced 2 harvests a year. Its people were devoted above all other gods to Apollo, who visited the island every 19 years and played his lyre and danced continuously from the vernal equinox until the rising of the Pleiades. The island had a magnificent temple to Apollo, spherical in shape, adorned with many offerings. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, preserved Hecataeus's account in his library of history and expanded it with details that make the northern island seem startlingly specific and culturally coherent. In Diodorus's telling, the Hyperboreans had their own language distinct from any other known tongue, but were particularly friendly toward the Greeks, and specifically toward the Athenians and the Delians, with whom they had maintained goodwill from the earliest times. Certain Greeks had visited the Hyperboreans in antiquity and left behind costly votive offerings inscribed in Greek letters. And Abaris the Hyperborean had journeyed southward to renew ties of kinship and friendship between his people and the Delians. There was a genuine, persistent, two-directional exchange in Diodorus's account. Not merely the Hyperboreans sending gifts southward, but Greeks traveling north and Hyperboreans traveling south, in a pattern of mutual visitation that made the two cultures seem genuinely connected rather than merely mythologically linked. The detail about the moon in Diodorus is also notable. He records the tradition that from the Hyperborean island, the moon appeared very close to the earth, with prominences visible on its surface, which to modern ears sounds either like an early observation through some form of optical instrument, or like a mythological expression of the idea that in the north, even the heavens drew closer, that the divine was more accessible there and the barriers between the earthly and the celestial were thinner. Scholars have spent considerable energy on this description because it is so specific and because it matches, in several intriguing ways, the British Isles. An island no smaller than Sicily beyond the land of the Celts. At the time Hecataeus was writing, the Celts dominated much of Central and Western Europe, so the island beyond them would be Britain. A temperate climate and extraordinary agricultural productivity. Britain in classical antiquity was known for its fertility, a devotion to a solar deity and a great circular sacred structure. Stonehenge, or alternatively the Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, whose stones are arranged in a pattern that tracks the 19-year lunar cycle with extraordinary precision. The Stonehenge identification has been the subject of serious scholarly debate. Those who support it point to the spherical temple description. Spherical in shape could describe the circular arrangement of standing stones that characterizes Stonehenge. They note that Stonehenge has been associated with solar worship since at least the Late Bronze Age, that its alignment with the summer solstice sunrise is deliberate and precise, and that Greeks of the classical period might easily have heard second- or third-hand reports of a great circular stone structure dedicated to a solar deity on a northern island. Those who remain skeptical note that Stonehenge is in Wiltshire, in the south of England, while the 19-year lunar cycle is more precisely tracked by the Callanish stones in the Outer Hebrides, and that the classical description's 2 harvests a year and unusually temperate climate fit the Hebrides poorly at best. The archaeologist Aubrey Burrell argued specifically that the Callanish stones were more likely the candidate, given their 19-year lunar tracking. John Toland, writing in 1726, made the same argument, explicitly identifying Diodorus's spherical temple with the Callanish complex on the Isle of Lewis. Others have proposed Iceland, Jutland in Denmark, the Faroe Islands, or various parts of Scandinavia. What is clear is that by the Hellenistic period, Hyperborea was being actively mapped onto the actual geography of northern Europe as that geography became better known through Greek and later Roman exploration. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History completed in 77 of the Common Era, was fascinated by Hyperborea but characteristically ambiguous about it. He gave 5 different possible locations across his work: the extreme north of Eastern Europe, more southerly regions, northern China, and a northern Atlantic island. He described the Hyperboreans in vivid terms: a happy race that lived to an extreme old age, whose abodes were the woods and groves, who worshipped the gods singly and in groups, among whom all discord and all manner of sickness were utterly unknown. Death came to them only when they were satiated with life, after a career of feasting in an old age sated with every luxury, and when that moment came, they leaped from a certain rock into the sea, which they considered the most desirable mode of ending existence. This last detail is extraordinary and is unique to Pliny among the major classical sources. The Hyperboreans chose their death. They ate and feasted and enjoyed their lives until they had had enough, and then they walked to a cliff and jumped into the sea. Not from despair, not from illness or pain, but from completeness, from satisfaction. It was the death of a life fully lived and fully enjoyed, a death that was not an interruption of happiness but its natural conclusion. In a world where most people died badly, of plague, of war wounds, of slow diseases, of the horrible deterioration of extreme old age, the Hyperborean death by choice was yet another utopian inversion, the replacement of death as loss with death as fulfillment. Pomponius Mela, the Roman geographer writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, placed Hyperborea in the remotest part of Scythia beyond the north wind, where the sun shone continuously throughout the summer and the climate was temperate. His inhabitants lived for 1,000 years, free from disease and warfare, their lives spent in perpetual happiness and peace. Strabo, who was one of the more skeptical ancient geographers, placed Hyperborea vaguely beyond Scythia, dismissing the more fabulous claims while acknowledging the role of the northern people in poetic tradition. Ptolemy and Marcion of Heraclea both placed Hyperborea in the North Sea, which they called the Hyperborean Ocean, a body of water that corresponded roughly to what we now call the Arctic Ocean or the Norwegian Sea. What all these accounts shared, despite their geographical disagreements, was a consistent description of the people and their way of life. However far north they were placed, the Hyperboreans were always the same: blessed, long-lived, free from suffering, devoted to Apollo, sending sacred gifts southward, isolated from the rest of humanity by the natural and supernatural barriers of their geography. The location was negotiable. The identity was not. This is instructive. It suggests that Hyperborea was not primarily a geographical claim at all. It was a claim about human possibility, about what a people could be if they were sufficiently far from the corrupting influences of ordinary civilization, sufficiently close to the divine. Every culture that encountered the Hyperborea tradition felt entitled to locate it in their own particular unknown north, to drape the universal story of the blessed people over whatever northern territory their own geography presented as mysterious. The Hyperboreans moved as knowledge moved, keeping pace with the expanding edge of the known world, always maintaining their position just past the last verified human settlement. The collapse of the classical world did not kill Hyperborea. It changed it as it changed everything else, stripped away some of its Greek specificity, loaded it with new meanings, sent it in directions the original poets and historians would probably have found bewildering. But the myth survived. It survived because it answered needs that did not expire when the Roman Empire fell or when Christian theology replaced the Olympian pantheon. The need for a perfect beginning, a place of pure origin, a northern source of wisdom and grace. These needs were not products of any particular culture. They were products of being human. In medieval and early Renaissance literature, Hyperborea functioned primarily as a symbol of remoteness and exotic foreignness. When a writer needed to convey that something was extremely far away, extremely strange, extremely removed from the ordinary world of European experience, the Hyperboreans made a useful reference. They had lost most of their specific theological content, their connection to Apollo, their ritual life, their specific geography of the Riphean Mountains, and became simply a shorthand for the impossibly distant north, the place at the edge of the world where ordinary rules did not apply. But with the Renaissance and its passionate recovery of classical texts, the more specific and theologically rich version of the Hyperborea tradition came back into circulation. Scholars who were reading Pindar and Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus for the first time in generations encountered the full complexity of the ancient accounts. The offerings to Delos, the 19-year cycle of Apollo's visit, the circular temple, the 2 harvests a year, and began to argue seriously about what these descriptions referred to, where the place actually was, whether the myths encoded genuine historical memory. The most dramatic and extreme expression of this Renaissance recovery was the work of Olof Rudbeck, a Swedish scholar of the 17th century who was a genuinely brilliant figure, a medical researcher who had discovered the lymphatic system, an architect who had designed Uppsala Cathedral, a man of formidable intellectual energy who unfortunately directed much of that energy toward proving that Sweden was Atlantis, Hyperborea, the Garden of Eden, and the original home of all human civilizations simultaneously. Rudbeck published his great work, Atlantica, in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702. In it, he argued that the descriptions of the blessed northern land in the classical sources corresponded with unmistakable precision to the geography of Sweden. The long summer days of the Swedish north explained the midnight sun that classical authors had associated with Hyperborea. The Swedish landscape matched the descriptions in Hecataeus and Diodorus. The ancient burial mounds of the Uppsala region were the graves of the Hyperborean kings. The Old Norse mythological tradition preserved the original form of the Hyperborean religion that had subsequently been transmitted to Greece and given rise to the Olympian pantheon. Rudbeck was not unaware that he was making extraordinary claims. He was aware. He simply believed they were warranted by the evidence, and he spent decades accumulating correlations between Swedish topography, linguistics, archaeology, and the classical texts. His methodology was, by modern standards, deeply flawed. He was prone to finding connections that were not there, to fitting data to his predetermined conclusion rather than allowing the data to suggest its own conclusion. But within the intellectual framework of the 17th century, with its passion for finding classical origins for modern nations, his work was enormously influential. The idea that Sweden was Hyperborea passed into the mainstream of Swedish nationalist thought and remained there for generations. What drove Rudbeck was not merely nationalism, though nationalism was certainly present. It was also the passion of a genuine scholar who had spent years immersed in classical texts and could not help but see, everywhere he looked in Swedish history and landscape, echoes of what those texts described. His reading was, to use a modern term, confirmation biased on an epic scale. But the scale of his project, 4 enormous volumes comprising thousands of pages of argument, correlation, and illustration, also reflected a real and serious intellectual engagement with the question of where European civilization had its roots. Rudbeck was wrong by the standards of modern historical scholarship. But he was wrong in a way that was productively wrong, in that his arguments forced subsequent scholars to take the question of northern origins seriously and to develop better methodologies for answering it. Rudbeck was the most famous but not the only representative of what scholars have called Gothicism, the intellectual tradition that identified the Gothic or Scandinavian peoples as the original source of European civilization. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this tradition was powerful throughout Northern Europe. Germans, Danes, Swedes, and eventually also Russians all had versions of the argument that their own northern ancestors were the original civilized humanity, the Hyperborean people whose cultural contributions had flowed southward to give rise to the Mediterranean classical traditions that educated Europeans most admired. If civilization had come from the north, if Hyperborea was the original culture, then the northern peoples were not the barbarian latecomer to history but its authors. This was a politically convenient myth for nations that felt themselves to be on the cultural periphery of a Europe dominated by Mediterranean models and classical memory. The Hyperborea tradition gave the North a way to claim priority rather than derivation, to argue that it was not Northern Europe that owed its civilization to Greece and Rome, but that Greece and Rome had owed their ultimate origins to a northern paradise that had preceded them both. The 19th century deepened this process in ways that eventually led to deeply troubling places. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, published The Secret Doctrine in 1888, one of the most influential and controversial esoteric texts of the modern period. In it, she developed a comprehensive cosmological system based on the concept of root races, successive civilizations that had inhabited and lost different continents across an enormous span of geological and spiritual time. The Hyperborean root race was her second root race, following the Polarian race that had existed at the literal North Pole. The Hyperboreans, in Blavatsky's system, had inhabited a vast continent that covered what is now northern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Scandinavia, and northern Russia, a continent that had existed in a time before the Earth developed its current axial tilt, when the polar regions enjoyed a tropical climate. In Blavatsky's account, the Hyperboreans were not the shining, music-making festival people of Pindar's odes. They were ethereal, barely physical creatures. They reproduced by budding rather than by sexual generation, and their consciousness was at a stage of development that had not yet arrived at the full self-awareness of modern humanity. They were, in a sense, pre-human humans, luminous, spiritually connected, existing in a state of grace that had not yet descended into the full weight of matter and individuality. The golden age of Hyperborea was, for Blavatsky, literally a different stage of cosmic evolution. a phase of human development that no longer existed because the Earth and humanity had both moved on. Blavatsky's system was deeply influential on a generation of esoteric thinkers, René Guénon, Julius Evola, and others who developed their own elaborate mythologies of primordial northern civilization and subsequent spiritual decline. For all of these thinkers, Hyperborea represented a lost perfection, not the poetic perfection of Pindar's lyric imagination, but a cosmological perfection, a state of being that humanity had literally inhabited before the long descent into the materialism and suffering of the present age. The North was not merely the direction of spiritual possibility, it was the direction of spiritual origin. It was where humanity had come from, in the deepest and most literal sense. The Indian scholar Bal Gangadhar Tilak, writing in 1903 in his work The Arctic Home in the Vedas, brought a different and more scholarly form of the same northern origin thesis. Tilak was a respected Sanskrit scholar who argued, from close analysis of astronomical references in the oldest Vedic hymns, that those hymns had been composed by people living within the Arctic Circle, in a land where the sun did not rise for months in winter and did not set for months in summer. The astronomical references in the Vedas that described these phenomena, he argued, were not metaphorical. They were literal descriptions of the Arctic sky. The ancestral Indo-Europeans, the people whose language and culture gave rise to both Sanskrit and Greek, had originated in or near the Arctic, and their earliest sacred literature preserved the memory of that origin. Tulloch's argument was serious enough to attract serious scholarly attention, and serious scholars have had serious disagreements about it for over a century. The mainstream view of modern Indo-European studies does not support an Arctic origin for the Proto-Indo-Europeans. The consensus currently places their homeland in the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, not in the Arctic Circle. But the debate Tulloch's work generated, and the fact that it generated serious debate, is itself significant. It showed that the question of a northern human origin was not merely a matter of myth and esoteric speculation. It could, at least theoretically, be a question for archaeology, linguistics, and astronomy as well. There is a shadow side to the history of Hyperborea that cannot be passed over without acknowledgement, because that shadow has grown larger in the modern period and because understanding it is necessary for understanding the full significance of the myth. The Northern Paradise, in the hands of certain ideologues and racial theorists of the late 19th and 20th centuries, was transformed from a symbol of universal human longing into a justification for exclusion, hierarchy, and ultimately atrocity. The connection between the Hyperborea tradition and racial nationalism emerged gradually from the confluence of theosophical thought, German Romantic nationalism, and the pseudo-scholarly Ariosophical movement of the early 20th century. Thinkers like Guido von List and Georg Lanz von Liebenfels in Vienna in the early 1900s developed elaborate mythologies of a primordial Aryan race descended from Hyperborean ancestors, a race that had degenerated through racial mixing and needed to be purified and restored. Their ideas drew on Blavatsky's root race cosmology, on the Romantic nationalist tradition that claimed the Germanic peoples as the heirs of the original northern civilization, and on the pseudoscientific racial theories of the period. These ideas flowed into the intellectual currents that helped shape National Socialism. Heinrich Himmler was famously obsessed with mythological archaeology and the search for Aryan origins. SS researchers and affiliated organizations conducted expeditions looking for evidence of the ancient northern civilization they believed had given rise to the Germanic people. The Hyperborea myth was not the central pillar of Nazi ideology. That position was occupied by more immediately political and economic doctrines, but it provided a mythological framework that gave the racial hierarchy of Nazi thought a cosmological grounding. The Aryan race was not merely politically superior, it was cosmically prior, descended from the original luminous civilization of the blessed North. After World War II, remnants of this esoteric tradition continued in the work of figures like Miguel Serrano, a Chilean diplomat and mystic who developed what he called esoteric Hitlerism, an elaborate mythology in which the Aryan race was literally descended from extraterrestrial beings who had once inhabited Hyperborea, and in which the racial struggle was a cosmic drama between light-bearing northern beings and various forces of darkness. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue reported in 2021 that Hyperborean imagery and symbolism were increasingly appearing in neo-Nazi content on social media, particularly among young users on TikTok, where the ancient myth had been conscripted into the service of contemporary extremism. It is important to say clearly what all serious scholars of the ancient world say on this subject. The appropriation of the Hyperborea myth by racial nationalists represents a profound distortion of what the ancient sources actually described. The Greeks, in their various accounts of the Hyperboreans, never described them in racial terms. They described them in terms of geography, climate, religious devotion, and divine favor. The idea that the Hyperboreans were a specific racial group, blonde, blue-eyed, ancestrally Germanic, is a 19th and 20th century invention with no basis in the classical texts. Herodotus gave no physical description of the Hyperboreans at all. Pindar cared nothing about their racial composition. The Hyperboreans of classical mythology were a mythological category, not a biological one. Their blessedness derived from where they lived and who they worshipped, not from any heritable physical characteristic. The appropriation of ancient myths by modern political ideologies is not unique to Hyperborea. The same thing has happened with Troy, with Atlantis, with the Norse mythological tradition, with dozens of other ancient stories that had the misfortune to become convenient symbols for people with agendas the original creators would have found unrecognizable. The mythology itself is not responsible for these distortions. But the distortions need to be named because they are real and they are ongoing, and an honest account of Hyperborea's history in the modern world cannot pretend they do not exist. What the original myth was, stripped of its ideological accretions, was something far simpler and far more human. It was a story about the possibility of a good life. About a people who had somehow managed to maintain their connection to the divine, their harmony with nature, their joy in music and community, when everyone else had lost those things. It was a story that belonged to everyone who had ever looked at the world around them and sensed that something was missing, that life as it was being lived was not all that life could be, that somewhere, in some direction, the fullness that should be natural to existence was still intact and whole. If you pull back from the specific details of the Hyperborea myth, from Pindar's odes and Herodotus's careful skepticism and the relay of offerings across thousands of miles of ancient territory, and look at the broader pattern, something remarkable becomes visible. The Greeks were not alone in placing their paradise to the north. Across the breadth of the ancient world, from India to Scandinavia to the indigenous traditions of Siberia and the Americas, the north carried a specific mythological charge that separated it from the other directions. In Hindu cosmology, the land known as Uttarakuru lay to the north of the Himalayas, the great mountain barrier that sheltered the Indian subcontinent from the cold winds, just as the Riphean Mountains sheltered Hyperborea from the north wind in Greek imagination. Uttarakuru was described in the Mahabharata and in the Puranas as a paradise of extraordinary fertility and beauty. Its trees bore fruit and flowers perpetually. Its people lived 10,000 years without disease or aging. They never had to work for their food. They lived in harmony and joy, free from the conflicts that governed ordinary human existence. The correspondence with Hyperborea is striking enough to suggest not mere coincidence but some shared deep pattern in how these distant cultures imagined the ideal northward beyond horizon. The Sanskrit word Uttara means north, and it also means higher, superior, later in the sense of more advanced. The north was not simply a direction in the Sanskrit geographical imagination. It was also a direction of quality, of elevation, of spiritual altitude. Uttarakuru, the northern homeland of abundance, was literally the land of the superior north. The correspondence with the Greek hyper, meaning over and beyond, is not etymological. Greek and Sanskrit do share an ancestor language, Proto-Indo-European, but this particular convergence of northern paradise imagery is more likely a parallel development from shared human psychological structures than a directly inherited tradition. What is striking is not the possible linguistic connection but the conceptual one. Two major ancient civilizations developing their mythological geography independently, or at least semi-independently, both placed their visions of uncorrupted human possibility to the north of their known world, and both gave that northern paradise remarkably similar qualities. In the Norse mythological tradition, Asgard, the home of the gods, occupied a position symbolically analogous to Hyperborea, a realm of divine perfection set apart from the ordinary world of Midgard. Beyond Asgard lay the frozen realm of the frost giants, which corresponded in some ways to the icy wasteland that the Greeks imagined surrounding Hyperborea. And in the Norse mythological geography, the world tree Yggdrasil connected all the realms, a cosmic axis running from the deepest depths of Nibelheim, the land of ice and cold, through the middle world to Asgard at the summit. The north, in Norse cosmology, was not just where you went when you died. It was where the fundamental structures of existence were rooted. The Siberian shamanic traditions add yet another layer to this cross-cultural pattern. Among the Evenki, the Yakuts, the Buryat, and many other indigenous peoples of Siberia and Central Asia, the shamanic cosmology placed the source of divine power in the north, often specifically at a sacred mountain identified with the North Star's position in the sky, a mountain from which the cosmic axis descended into the earth and around which the entire spiritual universe was organized. The shaman's journey in many of these traditions was a journey northward and upward along this axis, toward the source of power and knowledge that the ordinary, earthbound, south-facing human world could not access. In this cosmology, the north was where wisdom lived, cold, clear, inaccessible to ordinary consciousness, available only to those who had been specifically trained and spiritually prepared to make the journey. Indigenous peoples of Siberia across a wide range of traditions describe sacred northern mountains, sometimes called the World Mountain, sometimes the Pole Star Mountain, as the axis around which the universe revolved, the center from which all sacred power radiated outward. Shamanic journeys in these traditions frequently involved travel northward and upward, toward the cosmic center that was also the cosmic north. The shaman's soul, moving in its ecstatic flight, moved in the direction of greatest sacred power, which was also the direction of the North Star, the fixed point around which the night sky seemed to rotate. The American scholar of the history of religions, Mircea Eliade, argued that what he called the axis mundi, the cosmic axis, the pole of the world, was one of the most fundamental and universal of all human religious symbols. Every human culture, he suggested, had some concept of a central point or direction from which sacred power emanated and toward which the soul was oriented in its deepest aspirations. And in an extraordinarily large number of these traditions, that direction was north. The pole star was in the north. The fixed point around which everything else moved was in the north. The direction that in the northern hemisphere pointed toward the cosmic constant, the one star that did not rise and set but remained always in the same position, was north. This may be one of the deepest roots of the Hyperborea tradition, the astronomical observation universal in the northern hemisphere, that the north is the direction of the fixed point. Every other star rises and sets, moves and changes. But the North Star, Polaris in our era, though the precession of the equinoxes means it was a different star in the ancient world, stays still. The sky rotates around it. It is the nail on which the universe hangs. And if you lived in a world where everything was understood through mythological rather than mechanical categories, where the sky was animated by divine intention rather than governed by physical law, then the fixed point of the cosmos was naturally also the point of divine presence. The place where things did not move was the place where the divine was most concentrated, most accessible, most clear. Hyperborea was, among other things, the mythological expression of this astronomical intuition. The north is where things stay the same. The north is where the ordinary vicissitudes of seasonal change, the death and rebirth of vegetation, the coming and going of the sun, are most extreme, most dramatic, but also, in a specific sense, most transparent. At the Arctic Circle, the midnight sun and the polar night are not metaphors. They are literal, overwhelming, disorienting experiences of the sun's power over time and experience. The Greeks, hearing accounts of these phenomena from travelers and traders who had been to the north, had to make sense of them within their mythological framework. A sun that does not set. Surely that is the sun at its most powerful, most divinely present. A land where the sun shines for months without ceasing. Surely that is a land where divine warmth is most concentrated, where the ordinary rules of day and night that govern ordinary mortal experience have been suspended by divine favor. The archaeologists Christian Christensen and Thomas Larson, writing about the Hyperborea tradition as a Bronze Age mythological relic, pointed to the migratory patterns of swans as another potential root of the myth. Swans, sacred to Apollo in the Greek tradition, intimately associated with the Hyperboreans in multiple myths, were known to migrate from the north. They arrived in Greece in autumn, coming from the distant north, appearing with the cold and departing with the warmth. For a culture that associated swans with Apollo and Apollo with winter and with the north, the annual arrival and departure of these beautiful, resonant birds was a kind of annual dispatch from Hyperborea, a physical embodiment of the connection between the sacred north and the ordinary south that the myth described in poetic terms. There is also something to be said about the specific appeal of cold and light as the combination that characterizes the northern mythological imagination. Cold is clarifying. Cold strips away the lush and complicated growth of warm climates, the jungle, the thicket, the overwhelming richness of the tropics, and reduces the world to its essential elements. In cold you see clearly. The lines are sharp. The sky is hard and brilliant. Snow reflects rather than absorbs light, so that a northern winter landscape at noon can be almost unbearably bright, the light bouncing from surface to surface with an intensity that the soft, hazy illumination of Mediterranean summers never achieves. The paradox of Hyperborea, a warm paradise set in a cold northern latitude, may encode this visual experience. The north is where you go for clarity, for the stripped-down essential vision, for the blinding white light that corresponds to spiritual revelation. There is, too, the ancient appeal of the idea that the origin is pure. In almost every human mythological tradition, the beginning is better than what follows. The Garden of Eden exists before the fall. The Golden Age precedes the silver, the bronze, the iron. The ancestors were wiser, healthier, longer lived. The first people walked more closely with the gods. Whether this universal myth of the degraded present and the pure origin reflects some deep psychological truth about how human consciousness experiences time, always moving away from something rather than towards something, or whether it is simply the narrative logic of meaning-making, the fact is that the northern origin myth gave this universal pattern a geographical expression. The pure beginning was not just before us in time, it was above us in space. It was north. It was real, or at least as real as anything that far away and that long ago could be determined to be. This gave the myth a peculiar resilience. You could argue against a temporal golden age. You could point to archaeology and say that primitive people lived hard and short and painful lives, that there was no historical golden era of peaceful abundance. But you could not so easily argue against a geographical paradise that was still, theoretically, up there somewhere beyond the last verified horizon. As long as there was unexplored territory to the north, Hyperborea could persist. And the Arctic, even today, retains some of that quality of the unreachable. Not because it is physically unreachable, but because it is so inhospitable to ordinary human habitation that it still feels like the edge of a different world. Modern Hyperborea has moved. It lives now in the underwater realm, in space, in the digital beyond, in any dimension of experience that current technology has not yet fully mapped. The impulse that built the myth of Hyperborea is the same impulse that builds science fiction, that imagines utopias on distant planets, that looks for pure civilizations in any direction that current certainty has not yet colonized. Perhaps that is the deepest truth about the Hyperborea myth. It is not a story about a place. It is a story about the human relationship to the unknown. Every generation has its own north, its own blank space on the map of experience where the longing for uncorrupted possibility gets written. The ancient Greeks wrote theirs in wheat straw and offerings and the swan song of Apollo's winter migration. We write ours in different languages, on different media, toward different horizons. But we are writing the same thing. We are drawing the same map. We are all, in our different ways, sending offerings northward through the relay chain, hoping they arrive at the place where the God is most present, and that something, some warmth, some music, some grace from the perfect land, will eventually make its way back to us in return. The Hyperborea myth, viewed from this widest perspective, is not just a Greek story. It is a human story. It is the story that human beings tell themselves about the direction of perfection, about where the uncorrupted origin is located, about which way you must travel to find the version of existence that has not yet fallen. It changes its specific dress from culture to culture, from era to era. It becomes the Hyperboreans of Pindar's Odes, and then Hecataeus' island beyond the Celts, and then Rudbeck's Sweden, and then Blavatsky's second root race, and then something else again in the next generation. The specific geography shifts endlessly. The emotional content remains constant. Beyond the last known edge of the world, in the direction that is also the direction of the fixed stars, something perfect is waiting. Something that has never fallen. Something that still holds the shape of what existence could be if humanity had not, somewhere long ago, made a wrong turn. What do we do with Hyperborea now, in an age when satellite imagery has mapped every inch of the Arctic, when expeditions have reached the North Pole and found no paradise there, when the ancient terra incognita has been replaced by data and GPS coordinates? Has the myth simply been disproven? Has the place been found empty, and the idea dismissed? The answer, in one sense obviously, is no. Because Hyperborea was never primarily a claim about physical geography. It was, from its earliest literary expressions, a claim about human possibility, about what a people could be, what a society could achieve, what quality of life was theoretically available to a community that had maintained its connection to the divine and to the natural order. The fact that no such place exists on any physical map is not a refutation of the myth any more than the non-existence of a literal Elysian fields refutes the idea that some human lives are more blessed than others, or that the non-existence of a literal Garden of Eden refutes the human experience of innocence lost. The modern scholar looking at the Hyperborea tradition sees several different layers operating simultaneously. At the oldest layer, there are almost certainly fragments of real Bronze Age cultural memory, the amber trade, the swans, the northern peoples with their different customs and their remarkable astronomical observations preserved in structures like Stonehenge or the Callanish stones. Neath the poetry and the mythology, something real was being registered, even if the poetry transformed it almost beyond recognition. At a second layer, there is the cosmological imagination of the archaic and classical Greek world. The geography of divine presence, the mapping of sacred quality onto physical direction, the theological use of the northern paradise to say something true about the nature of grace. At a third layer, there is the endlessly generative use of the myth by subsequent eras, each one finding in it what it needed to find. National origin, esoteric wisdom, racial charter, poetic inspiration, philosophical example. The third layer is the most dangerous because it has the loosest relationship to whatever the myth originally meant. When a myth becomes available for any use, it becomes available for bad uses as well as good ones. The Hyperborean tradition's most tragic transformation was its weaponization by racist ideology, which stripped away everything about the myth that was universal and human and replaced it with something narrow, exclusionary, and ultimately murderous. That transformation was not inevitable. It required specific historical conditions, specific intellectual choices, specific failures of critical thinking. And it can be undone, not by pretending the dark history did not happen, but by returning the myth to what it actually was before it was hijacked. A story about the universal human longing for a life worth living. What we are left with, after stripping away the layers of misuse and returning to the original sources, is a myth of remarkable beauty and remarkable insight. It is a myth that says the divine is real and that the divine has preferences, that something in the structure of the cosmos favors the musical, the communal, the joyful, the peaceable. That Apollo, the god of light and prophecy and music, genuinely loved his northern people and genuinely chose to spend his winters among them. That the sacred offerings wrapped in wheat straw genuinely arrived at Delos through the hands of a dozen different peoples who had agreed, without any formal treaty, to carry them onward. That somewhere, even if that somewhere is not a physical place but a quality of existence, the music does not stop. The lyres do not fall silent. The maidens do not grow old. The god continues to dance. The ancient Delians maintained the graves of the Hyperborean women for centuries, not because they could prove the women had existed in any archaeologically verifiable sense, but because the tradition was true in the way that important traditions are true, not as fact, but as bearing, as something that held weight, that pointed toward the real, that organized the sacred life of a community around a relationship with something more perfect than itself. The young people of Delos cut their hair for the Hyperborean maidens. The boys offered the first growth of their beards. These were not acts of credulity. They were acts of orientation, gestures that said, we know something perfect existed in the direction of the north, and we are grateful for the gifts that travel to us from there, and we maintain our connection to it through the only means available to mortals. Through beauty, through ceremony, through the faithful repetition of a gesture that means we have not forgotten. That is what Hyperborea means ultimately. Not a lost continent, not a racial homeland, not an esoteric secret, but the faithful repetition of a gesture that means we have not forgotten, that somewhere beyond the north wind, the spring is eternal, the music is continuous, and the God of light is laughing with pleasure at the abundance of his people's devotion. Pindar knew this. When he wrote that neither by ship nor on foot could you find the marvelous road to the gathering of the Hyperborean people, he was not making a statement about the inadequacy of Greek navigation technology. He was making a metaphysical statement. Hyperborea was not the kind of thing you could arrive at through effort or ambition. It was not a destination that could be added to a travel itinerary. It was a condition, a state of being in which the separation between the human and the divine had been overcome, in which the suffering that normally characterized mortal existence had been dissolved by continuous proximity to beauty and to the sacred. You could not sail to that state. You could not walk to it. It received you or it did not. The modern scholarly consensus on Hyperborea is that it represents what one researcher called an amalgam of ancient utopianism, edge-of-the-world storytelling, the cult of Apollo, and exaggerated accounts of real phenomena in Northern Europe. That is a careful and accurate description. But it is not quite complete because it does not address why those elements combined in the particular way they did, why the resulting myth was so durable, why it kept being rewritten and relocated and revised for more than 2,000 years rather than simply fading as the geography of the North became better known. The durability of the myth suggests that it was answering something real. Not a question about geography, but a question about the nature of human experience. The question of whether the good life was possible. The question of whether a community could actually achieve harmony rather than merely theorize about it. The question of whether divine favor was real or merely a consolation invented by people who could not otherwise explain why some lives seemed charmed and others seemed cursed. Hyperborea was the Greeks' way of saying, yes, the good life is possible. Yes, a community can achieve harmony. Yes, divine favor is real, and it produces this eternal spring, music without end, freedom from the suffering that everyone else lives with. That the Hyperboreans existed beyond the reach of ordinary human access was not merely a geographical limitation. It was a structural necessity of the myth's function. If Hyperborea were reachable, it could be colonized, spoiled, turned into something ordinary by the ordinary human tendency to ruin good things. Its inaccessibility was what preserved its purity, and the preservation of its purity was what allowed it to function as the proof that purity was possible, that the world had not fallen so completely that no corner of original grace remained. Across the centuries, what different eras have done with the Hyperborea myth reveals something about what each era most needed to believe. The classical Greeks needed to believe that divine favor was real and that the good life was not merely a philosophical abstraction. The Renaissance scholars needed to believe that their own northern homelands were not the cultural periphery of civilization but its origin. The Theosophists needed to believe that the spiritual evolution of humanity pointed toward a polar axis of transcendence. The nationalists who corrupted the myth needed to believe that their particular group was the heir of primordial perfection. Each era projected onto the blank northern canvas what it most needed to see there. And what do we need to see? What is the persistence of Hyperborea, still referenced, still evoked, still appearing in contemporary culture from fantasy fiction to TikTok? Tell us about what we are still looking for. Perhaps the same thing that everyone has always been looking for. Evidence that the world is not as broken as it appears. Evidence that somewhere, in some direction we have not yet fully explored, inward if not outward, symbolic if not geographic, there exists a quality of existence that our own ordinary lives only imperfectly approximate. Not paradise in the theological sense, not an afterlife or a supernatural realm, but something more immediate. A way of being alive that does not cost so much. A mode of community that produces joy rather than conflict. A relationship with the natural world and with the sacred that does not require suffering as its foundation. This is what the myth has always been. Not an account of a lost civilization waiting to be archaeologically excavated. Not a code for a racial hierarchy. Not a literal geography for literal cartographers. But a persistent, insistent, cross-cultural argument that human existence is capable of more than it currently achieves, and that the direction in which that more lies is the direction of the uncorrupted, the unspoiled, the place at the far edge of the map where the old dispensation has never been cancelled. No ship and no foot can find that road, as Pindar said, but something in us keeps trying to walk it anyway. Something in us keeps looking toward the north, toward the fixed star, toward the direction that does not move, and hoping that in that stillness, in that enormous cold clarity, the eternal spring is still waiting, that the lyres are still playing, that the God of light is still dancing among his people, and that the door somewhere is open. We have traveled a great distance tonight, not in miles but in the kind of depth that only history and myth together can create. From the earliest fragments of Hesiod to the shining odes of Pindar, from Herodotus's measured skepticism to the sacred graves on Delos that archaeologists found exactly where the ancient text said they would be, from the Renaissance scholars who declared their homelands the original paradise to the theosophical cosmologists who mapped the entire spiritual evolution of humanity onto a polar axis. The story of Hyperborea is, in the end, the story of what human beings do with their longing. We locate it. We give it a name. We draw it on a map, and then when the map expands, we redraw it a little further north, a little past the new edge, always just beyond the last confirmed horizon. And in doing so, we are not being naive. We are being something very old, very deep, and very human. We are saying that the world as it is does not exhaust the world as it could be. That somewhere beyond the north wind, the music is still playing. That the sacred gifts are still being wrapped in wheat straw and sent southward, hand to hand, across the long chain of nations all the way to us. What the Greeks understood, at their most penetrating, was that the power of the myth lay not in its truth as geography but in its truth as aspiration. Hyperborea did not need to be findable. It needed to be real in the way that the ideal is real, not as a fact but as a direction. As the name for what you are aiming at when you do your best work, when you play the music that makes people forget their suffering for a moment, when you build the community that holds together through difficulty, when you tend the relationships that make life worth living. Every act of beauty, every gesture of grace, every moment of genuine community, these were the mortal approximations of the permanent Hyperborean condition. They were the South's offerings to the North, the human world's way of staying connected to the divine world it could not reach but could not stop reaching for. The sun set only once a year in Hyperborea, and it always rose again. There is something worth holding on to in that. Something worth bringing with you into whatever comes next. If this story found you tonight, if it gave you something to carry, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Sleep Story. Every video on this channel is made with care, for those who want their nights to hold something more than silence. We hope to see you again wherever the next road leads.